And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. The first aircraft crash was a Wright Model A aircraft at Fort Myer, Virginia on September 17, 1908, injuring its co-inventor and pilot, Orville Wright. On today's Open Connection, we open our archives to bring you this story about the Skylink crash of 1989.
Tuesday, September 26, 1989, was just a few hours old for the 7 people on board the Skylink Metroliner aircraft when their lives came to a violent end. Skylink flight number 070 was a direct flight from Vancouver to Terrace. It was to go on to Smithers, but at 8:26 that Tuesday morning, while approaching to land, the plane slammed into a forested area about 600 meters west of the airport. It shredded into pieces, burst into flames, instantly killing the 2 pilots and 5 passengers. No one actually saw the plane go down, just to the side of Beam Station Road, which runs along the airport perimeter fence. And it took emergency officials some time to find the crash site, finally spotting it from a helicopter called in to help with the search. A tanker truck from the Thornhill Fire Department happened to be working in the area. It was one of the first safety vehicles to reach the site and extinguish the intensely flaming wreckage. The fire had burned for about half an hour. Meanwhile, officials at the Terrace Hospital had been warned to expect casualties and were setting out stretchers and doing other preparations. And RCMP moved quickly to secure the crash site. In no uncertain terms, reporters were ordered well out of the area.
The police are only here for security and safeguarding of property.
Even people who have to use the Beam Station Road to reach their homes were forced to turn back. It would be several hours before the road was opened for public use. To begin with, reporters could get no information from the police or other officials about what was happening at the small cluster of emergency vehicles gathered a half-kilometer down the gravel road. A helicopter was chartered to fly a TV cameraman above the site, but the chopper could only make a few brief passes over the scene before the pilot was ordered out of the vicinity by emergency officials. Finally, a fire truck drove out, but the stern-faced firemen would not talk. They said they'd been told not to. Then an ambulance left the site and drove back towards Terrace, followed soon after by a second ambulance, neither vehicle using its emergency lights or sirens. And at the hospital, the group of doctors and nurses suddenly fell quiet for a moment. Word had been received. No one needed medical attention. There were no survivors. Terrace coroner Jim Lynch made the first official announcement.
What we have at the present time is we have the airplane, which was the Skylink, and I believe it's crashed just off the road, just right alongside the road, as a matter of fact, and we have 7 people confirmed dead. The pilot, the co-pilot, and 5 passengers.
Logger Bill McAllister was working in the area and drove by the site just after the crash.
We seen the crew just off the side of the road in the ditch. There's a trench mark from where the plane went right between 2 poles, and then a big strip of trees taken out about probably 50, 75 yards in, and about probably, I don't know, 50 feet, 60 feet across. And son, really, they won't let you guys.
Almost as soon as the Skylink plane went down, speculation rose about the cause of the crash. Much of the Terrace airport that Tuesday morning was covered with a layer of fog, and there was also some smoke in the area, which may have further hindered visibility for the pilot. The evening before the crash, the Forest Service had set 2 large controlled slash burns, generating huge smoke columns. The fires, which were close to the airport, were still smoldering the morning of the crash.
We just drove through the controlled burn there to go tell the guys we're working with that the trucks weren't coming through, eh? Yeah. And you couldn't even see 10 feet in front of you there. And it looks like all the smoke's blowing right towards the airport.
From the beginning, many people thought the poor visibility must have been a factor in the cause of the crash.
We had heavy fog. We also had this morning slash burning, which probably contributed to it. So visibility was just nil. So presumably that the pilot obviously couldn't see where he was going and must have overshot the runway or just looking for the airport.
During the first few hours following the crash, finding information about Skylink flight number 070 was not easy. Airport officials, like Skylink employees, would say nothing.
Like on statistics,
no comment at all. Zippo, nothing, sorry.
Listen to the radio.
Not surprisingly, inaccurate information about the crash surfaced. Initial reports said 8 people were killed, not 7. It was first reported 2 of the dead came from Terrace. They were actually from Smithers. And the Skylink plane was making its first attempt to land and was not on its second approach, as one official had indicated. On the afternoon of that fateful Tuesday, Transport Canada officials flew to Terrace from Vancouver and held a news conference, but there was very little new information.
At this point, what we can confirm is that it did crash in heavy fog. There were 5 passengers on board and 2 crew members. The RCMP have confirmed that there are no survivors, and the Canadian Aviation Safety Board will be arriving to investigate.
Rogier was, however, able to shed some light on weather conditions at the time of the crash.
What I have is that it was partially cloudy with scattered cloud at 600 feet, scattered cloud at 3,000 feet, scattered cloud at 12,000 feet with a ceiling at 25,000 feet.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. The Canadian Safety Board of Canada investigates civil aviation occurrences that take place in or over Canada and any place that is under Canadian air traffic control. Let us return to the archives to learn more about the cleanup process after a crash.
Also that Tuesday afternoon, local and Vancouver reporters were allowed out to the crash site for the first time. And although most of the site was off limits, behind police lines, even from the road, the awful destruction of the plane as it ripped up amongst the trees was graphically illustrated by the wreckage, some of it still impaled amongst the branches. Also that afternoon, BC Hydro crews moved to reconnect 2 power lines that had been snapped off by the plane as it plunged towards the ground. And RCMP and other officials continued their duties.
My responsibility as coroner is to be responsible for the bodies and for the living. I have to identify as to who the people were, and as well as that, I also have to get confirmation of the bodies and this, and just also to find out the cause of death, and to make sure that there is no foul play and or any medical reason at all for this death for the pilot and that. And we also try to do is we try to identify where they were sitting, and as a matter of fact to identify them. Some of the bodies are burnt very badly.
Wednesday morning, September 27th, the day after the fatal crash of Skylink Flight 070, and people line up at the Terrace Airport to catch their flights, including Skylink flights. The attendant at a neighboring airport car rental agency says it was business as usual for Skylink.
No, I didn't work yesterday, but today nothing was unusual.
They had a flight out this morning. Were there passengers lined up?
Yep, there was just as many passengers as there usually is.
About how many?
5 or 6.
Did people seem concerned? Were they milling around asking questions?
No, not at all.
Later that morning, more Aviation Safety Board inspectors arrive in Terrace from Ottawa, including Chief Inspector Roger Ayotte. Ayotte is briefed on what his team members have found out so far about the Skylink crash and then taken to the site. There, one of his leading priorities is to recover the aircraft's flight data recorders, the so-called black boxes.
There's an awful lot of destruction, both impact damage and fire damage to the aircraft. And we've just recovered the flight recorders, both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder from the wreckage. And they are both scorched somewhat over about half the surface. So those will have to be sent back to Ottawa, and hopefully the information that's inside of those will still be okay and won't be heat damaged.
Whenever a plane goes down in Canada, the crash is investigated by the Canadian Aviation Safety Board. The Skylink case is called high profile. There are 11 people working on it. Ayad is the coordinator of the investigation team, which is divided into groups, each with a specific responsibility.
The first priority is to get everybody together who's here, divide up what's going to happen, decide on who's going to do what, get out to see the site, see what conditions are, and then sit down and start the site survey. That's the most important thing as far as we're concerned. Leaving most of the material in situ, trying to find where the trail of wreckage begins and ends, checking to see if there's any tree strikes and that sort of thing. And then the teams are divided up and away they go on their own various disciplines.
The site survey is a detailed and time-consuming aspect of the investigation. Almost every piece of wreckage is identified and then plotted on a diagram. Hundreds of photographs are taken. The site survey is a meticulous look for physical clues to the cause of the crash.
It helps us determine where the aircraft was, the parts that were knocked off the aircraft first, and things of that sort. Yeah, it tells us what attitude the aircraft was in. You can tell by the shapes of the propellers, if there's propeller marks in the various trees and so on, if there was power being developed, that sort of thing. You know, this is standard for almost every investigation.
It's also standard for every airline crash that involves multiple fatalities for Transport Canada to bring in professionals to help deal with trauma. Often the scenes at a crash site are horrific. Dealing with them can cause a great deal of stress.
It's pretty recognized within any kind of industry with rescue services that the people that have to respond initially, that have to be on site, are under a great amount of stress. And they need to talk about it after to, just sort of talk out their stress.
By Wednesday afternoon, a Forest Service official has gone on record saying he doesn't believe smoke from the 2 slash burns was a contributing factor to the crash, pointing out the smoke didn't linger in the area, but traveled in a northwesterly direction, away from the airport. That opinion was backed up by one of the investigation team, who said poor visibility may have made it more difficult for the pilot, but wasn't thought to be the cause of the crash. However, the chief investigator was being very careful not to speculate.
Well, no, we can't speculate. In fact, we avoid that. The thing that we do here initially is we come here for a period of 1 to 2 weeks, and it's basically a data and fact collection process that we do during that period. And only once we've got all the data, then we can start looking at it, analyzing it, and hopefully come up with the cause of the accident. But we stay away from speculation.
Ayad is optimistic, however, about recovering the 2 flight data recorders.
Well, the flight recorders will be certainly be very important. So if we get some information out of the flight recorders, then that will be a big step forward, I feel.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. A flight recorder is an electronic recording device placed in an aircraft for the purpose of facilitating the investigation of aviation accidents or incidents. Let us return to the archives as investigators review the information from Skylink's flight.
Thursday, September 28th, the investigation team is headquartered at the Air Squadron building at the Terrace Airport. By now, 2 days after the crash, investigators have pieced together many of the circumstances surrounding the downing of Flight 070. They've listened to voice tapes of the conversation between the Skylink pilot and Terrace Flight Services.
The only thing we've been able to get from listening to that particular tape is that all the transmissions were normal, exactly what you'd expect for what was flown, and that there was no indication whatsoever of any problems with the airplane.
Investigators know a private Lear jet had landed at Terrace just a few minutes before the ill-fated Skylink flight. When the main runway is approached from the south, it's called runway 33. When it's approached from the north, it's called runway 15. The Lear jet had attempted to land from the south, but was forced to abort because of a heavy fog bank. It then made a second attempt from the north on runway 15 and landed successfully. The Learjet pilot was in radio contact with the Skylink pilot and advised him of the fog bank on runway 33 and to approach from the north, advice the Skylink pilot was apparently following.
Okay, this is a sketch of the Terrace airport, and the blue line actually represents what at this stage we feel to be the flight path over the ground of the aircraft. And the aircraft came in on what appeared to be a normal approach to the airport from this direction, And from witness accounts, we know that the airplane proceeded around to the left, flew behind the terminal area here, and then disappeared from view somewhere in this area here. It struck trees in this area, and a section of the right wing was torn off as a result of the impact with these trees, and flew in about another 300 yards or so and crossed over the road and crashed in the woods on the other side of the road.
When the plane clipped the treetops, some 300 meters before the crash site, 2 sections of wing were ripped off, one 4 feet long, the other 3 feet. Hayat could not say why the plane dipped as low as tree level, but he did say there was little chance of controlling the plane with 7 feet of wing missing.
So there's no question that there would have been major problems controlling the airplane with the damage that we see out there with this section of right wing that was torn off.
Also on Thursday, representatives from the manufacturers of the airplane and its engines arrived to help in the investigation. Aerial stereo photographs of the crash area were taken, and the aircraft's black boxes were being examined in Ottawa. Hayat was waiting to hear if their contents were intact. He was especially interested in hearing what was said between the pilot and co-pilot in the seconds leading up to impact.
It's normal for the 2 crew members to discuss whatever they're doing in the cockpit. So there may be valuable information there for us.
Within 2 days after the crash, Hayat said he was cautiously optimistic he'd find the cause of the accident, despite some aspects of this particular case that make it difficult.
Well, anytime you get an accident like this where there is severe impact damage to the airplane, the trees that the airplane went through were fairly large trees, some 12 inches in diameter. So there was considerable impact damage to the airplane. And on top of that, of course, there was a fire that broke out, and which again, fire and of course destroys a lot of the evidence and a lot of the aircraft itself.
Thursday, September 28th, was also the day Skeena MP Jim Fulton stood up in the House of Commons and, listing serious allegations, demanded the government pull the operating certificate of Skylink Airlines.
The pilot killed in the crash was time expired. This voids the insurance of the aircraft and the flight. The chief pilot, the brother of the deceased, has now resigned along with the majority of the 402 pilots due to safety concerns. The owner, Mr. Raphael Zur, has, I'm advised, been signing the logbooks in the place of unqualified pilots. Pilots are flying certain aircraft without proper qualifications. Aircraft are not being properly maintained. Of the 3 recent gear collapses, none of the aircraft have had their engines removed as required. A 402 recently had to glide into Vancouver International Airport to land due to the failure of the fuel selectors, which were installed backwards.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
In 1971, former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was alleged to have used some salty language at a Conservative MP. When asked in a media scrum what he said, Trudeau insisted he said, "fuddle-duddle." In this final segment of Open Connection, we start with a news report from 1989.
The president of Skylink Airlines says a member of parliament has made untrue and unfair allegations about his company. New Democrat
Skylink president Raphael Zur fought back, releasing a 5-page rebuttal to Fulton's allegations. Zur also chided Fulton for not confirming both sides of the story before making such serious allegations. But Fulton wasn't apologizing.
There was no longer any doubt whatsoever in my mind that the traveling public might be endangered by the operation, and I took what I think is the totally appropriate step, which is to put that information on the public record. And I advised a number of those people who had called information in to me that it's a criminal offense to mislead a member of parliament.
At the terrorist crash investigation headquarters, Chief Investigator Roger Hayat said Fulton's allegations would not influence their work.
No, we look at all aspects of Skylink's operation, and that's not because they're Skylink. We do that on any accident investigation. We look at how the operator runs his airline and how they do their maintenance, etc. So that's all part of a standard part of any investigation, and we'll be looking at that on this investigation.
And nothing in particular are more concentrated because of the allegations that were raised by the MP here?
No, we always do a thorough investigation of that nature.
While many of Fulton's allegations were wrong, Skylink has had its share of problems in the past. In August, 2 Skylink planes were forced to make emergency landings. A twin-engine Cessna carrying 4 people made a belly landing at Vancouver after the landing gear would not deploy because of a faulty switch. No one was hurt. Also in August, a Skylink Cessna burst into flames when it touched down at the Seattle-Tacoma airport. The fuel tank ruptured when the plane's landing gear collapsed. Again, no one was injured. In November 1988, the company and 3 employees were charged with 70 safety infractions relating to overloading planes on the Vancouver to Terrace route. Company president Raphael Zur pleaded guilty to 1 charge, and Skylink was fined $25,000. The other 69 charges were stayed. Skylink has also had its operating certificate suspended twice for improper maintenance. By Wednesday, October 3rd, 1 week exactly after the crash of Skylink Flight 070, every piece of wreckage had been removed from the crash site and taken to the Terrace Airport. The smaller pieces, thousands of them, are strewn across the floor of a warehouse, while the larger segments have been laid out on a nearby field in the approximate shape of the aircraft. Almost every piece has been identified and labeled. Aviation Safety Board investigators, along with RCMP, continued inspecting the wreckage, but much of it will be crated up and sent to Ottawa for more detailed analysis. Chief Inspector Roger Ayotte has been in Terrace a week. After 7 days, he's returning to Ottawa. But before going, Ayotte holds a press conference. Although careful not to speculate about the cause of the crash, Ayotte says it doesn't appear anything was wrong with the plane.
Well, at this time, we have no indication that there was any mechanical failure associated with the aircraft. Now, I must stress that when I say that is at this particular time. We have, as I said, we've got a lot of detailed examination of engines and propellers, etc., to do yet, and so we can't make a definitive statement on that until that time.
Investigators have also found out from the lab in Ottawa that the flight data recorder, for some reason, did not record compass readings. That is, the direction the plane was traveling just before crashing.
We certainly don't like to lose any information off the flight data recorder, but it's too early to say whether that information is actually pertinent or not at this time.
The destruction of Flight 070 cost 7 people their lives. It also raised many questions. The major question, of course, is what caused the plane to go down. Other questions revolve around the operating practices of Skylink, a 5-year-old commuter airline that transports some 130,000 passengers a year.
We're not perfect, but we well within standards, and I definitely don't feel that we've been treated fairly.
Still other questions were asked about the Terrace Airport. The Terrace mayor says it is a difficult airport for pilots to land at. However, he says improvements are in the works.
But there's no denying that there is some difficulty. We do get fog at this time of year, with the winter season starting to come. And we have to have our safety procedures in place, and I think the time will come when there will be a lot of improvements to this airport, and I think that time is not that far away.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance to the existence of man is not from here to there, but that connection from his mind to his heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.